In January 1944, as winter clouds pressed low over northern Europe, tens of thousands of German soldiers already believed they knew exactly what awaited them if they were captured by Britain. Long before any ship crossed the North Sea, before any train slowed at a rural English station, before any wire fence came into view, the image of British captivity had been built inside their minds with careful precision. It was not vague, it was not uncertain, it was detailed, reinforced, and absolute. They did not imagine confusion, they imagined punishment. For years, German soldiers had been taught that capture by the Western Allies was not a neutral military outcome, but a moral failure that would be repaid in humiliation and suffering. Britain, in particular, was presented not as a restrained imperial power, but as a calculating enemy, cold, vindictive, and quietly cruel. The idea was simple and relentlessly repeated. The British smiled, but behind the smile there was contempt. They spoke of rules, but they broke them when it suited them. A German who fell into British hands, the propaganda insisted, would be stripped of dignity first, comfort second, and hope last. By 1944, this belief was no longer questioned, it was assumed. German soldiers carried this certainty with them from the beaches of Normandy to the skies over the Channel, from the Atlantic U-boat pens to the deserts of North Africa. It followed them into battle, into retreat, and into surrender. Even those who doubted other parts of Nazi propaganda rarely doubted this. The fear of British captivity had become independent of ideology. It existed as practical knowledge, something learned and accepted like the recoil of a rifle or the sound of artillery. This certainty did not come from a single speech or poster. It was constructed slowly, layer by layer, over years of training, indoctrination, and repetition. From basic training onward, German recruits were taught that the enemy was not merely armed opposition, but a hostile civilization. Britain was described as decadent and hypocritical, obsessed with hierarchy, deeply hostile to Germany. Instruction manuals warned soldiers never to trust British politeness. Political officers explained that British camps appeared orderly only because cruelty there was systematic, not chaotic. Veterans returning from earlier phases of the war spoke of rumors, half-heard stories, and second-hand accounts, often exaggerated but rarely challenged. In the closed information environment of wartime Germany, these fragments merged into a coherent expectation. British captivity, they were told, meant forced labor under harsh supervision. It meant insufficient food, calculated humiliation, and the steady erosion of discipline and identity. German soldiers were warned they would be deliberately exposed to propaganda, mocked for their uniforms, and isolated from comrades. Officers were told that they would be treated with special suspicion. Enlisted men were told they would be used, discarded, and forgotten. Above all, they were told that Britain respected weakness only as something to exploit. The Geneva Convention was rarely discussed in detail. When it was mentioned, it was framed as a document the British invoked selectively. German training emphasized that international law existed in theory, but reality belonged to the victors. Capture by Britain was therefore not imagined as a pause in the war, but as a continuation of it by quieter means. This expectation shaped behavior on the battlefield. German units were often ordered to resist capture as long as possible, especially by British forces. In some theaters, surrender to American troops was considered marginally preferable, based on rumors of better treatment. Britain, by contrast, carried an older weight of hostility. It was the enemy from the First World War, the naval blockade power, the symbol of endurance against Germany's ambitions. British captivity felt personal, historical, and unforgiving. Even among civilians, the fear was deeply rooted. German propaganda portrayed British camps as places where men were deliberately broken, where national pride was dismantled piece by piece. Mothers feared British capture not only for their sons' bodies, but for their spirits. Wives were told their husbands would return unrecognizable if they returned at all. As the war turned against Germany after 1942, these fears intensified. Defeat did not soften expectations, it hardened them. The worse the military situation became, the more brutal the imagined consequences of capture grew. By 1943, stories circulated that British guards allowed prisoners to starve slowly, that camps were deliberately placed in cold, damp regions to weaken the men, that medical care was withheld as a matter of policy. None of these stories were verified. They did not need to be. They were consistent with what soldiers already believed. This psychological preparation was not accidental. The Nazi regime understood that fear of capture could be as powerful as loyalty to ideology. A soldier who feared surrender would fight longer, retreat slower, and obey orders more rigidly. British captivity became a tool, not just a threat. It was used to close the last mental exit from the battlefield. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, many German units were fighting with the knowledge that defeat no longer meant only military loss. It meant captivity under enemies they had been taught to fear for years. As Allied troops advanced through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, German soldiers faced a narrowing set of choices: retreat, death, or capture. Capture by Britain loomed large. Those taken prisoner in the early days of the Normandy campaign often expected immediate rough handling. They braced themselves for blows that did not come. They waited for insults, for confiscation of personal items, for visible signs of contempt. When these did not appear, the absence itself was unsettling. But expectation remained intact. They assumed this restraint was temporary. They told themselves it would change once they were out of sight of the battlefield. Transport reinforced these beliefs. German POWs were moved quickly, efficiently, and in large numbers. The very orderliness of the process fed suspicion. Lines were formed, names were taken, rations were distributed, silence was maintained. To men trained to see British politeness as a mask, this calm appeared calculated. It suggested planning. It suggested that the real treatment would come later. As prisoners were moved toward ports for transfer to Britain, anxiety deepened. Crossing the Channel carried symbolic weight. This was not merely relocation. It was entry into the heart of the enemy's world. For years, Britain had been described as a hostile island, distant, alien, and morally corrupt. Now, German soldiers were being carried toward it not as invaders, but as captives. During the crossing, many prisoners reported a profound sense of finality. They believed they were leaving Europe behind in a moral sense, not just a geographical one. Some destroyed personal items, letters, or insignia, fearing these would be used against them. Others memorized names of comrades, convinced separation was imminent and permanent. There was no singing. There was little conversation. Silence dominated, heavy and internal. Upon arrival in Britain, the first sights often contradicted expectation, but not in ways that immediately altered belief. Ports appeared undamaged compared to bombed German cities. Civilian workers moved calmly. There was no visible hatred. But again, prisoners assumed this was deliberate restraint. Britain, they believed, wanted to appear civilized while preparing something harsher out of sight. From ports, POWs were transported by train or truck to camps scattered across England, Scotland, and Wales. Many of these camps were located in rural areas, former military training grounds, or requisitioned estates. To German prisoners, the countryside itself felt unfamiliar. It did not match the industrial, grim Britain of propaganda images. Green fields and small villages created a dissonance that was difficult to process. But expectation adapted. Prisoners told themselves this beauty was irrelevant. Camps were hidden here for a reason. As transport vehicles slowed and wire fences came into view, mental preparation intensified. German soldiers straightened their posture, fixed their expressions, and braced for the first act of British authority. They expected shouting. They expected degradation rituals. They expected to be stripped of rank. Names were checked against lists. Medical inspections were conducted efficiently. Basic rules were explained. Prisoners were assigned huts or barracks. The process was quiet. Guards spoke briefly, often without raised voices. Orders were clear and limited in scope. This did not reassure the prisoners. It unsettled them. To men conditioned to equate cruelty with chaos, the absence of visible hostility created tension rather than relief. The mind searched for the hidden threat. They believed the British were observing, evaluating, waiting. They assumed compliance would be tested later, perhaps when resistance was no longer possible. Within the camps, German POWs observed details closely. Food portions were examined for signs of deception. Bedding was checked for cleanliness. Facilities were scrutinized for hidden intentions. Even the behavior of guards was interpreted through a lens of suspicion. Politeness was seen as condescension. Distance was interpreted as contempt. The prisoners did not yet question their beliefs. Instead, they searched for confirmation. Nazi indoctrination had prepared them well for this moment. It had taught them how to interpret contradictions without abandoning core assumptions. If reality did not match expectation, the explanation was simple. The reality was false. The real treatment would come later. Men spoke quietly about what they expected next. Reduced rations, hard labor, isolation, political re-education, the removal of officers, punishments for minor infractions. These were not speculative fears. They were treated as inevitabilities. This collective anticipation created a strange emotional environment. Prisoners lived in a state of suspended dread. The absence of overt brutality did not calm them. It sharpened anxiety. Every day that passed without confirmation of their fears increased the sense that something was being prepared. British camps, in these early weeks, were places of waiting, not only for release or exchange, but for the moment when expectation would finally align with experience. German POWs believed that alignment would come through suffering. What they did not yet understand was that the real conflict ahead would not be physical, it would be internal. By late 1944, as the war continued and the camps settled into routine, the first cracks in certainty began to appear, not as conclusions, but as questions. Small, unwelcome questions that prisoners pushed aside but could not entirely silence. Why had no punishment come yet? Why were rations consistent? Why were rules enforced without humiliation? These questions did not yet overthrow belief. They merely circled it. The moment of arrival had passed. The expected shock had not occurred. German prisoners now found themselves inside British camps, surrounded not by overt hostility, but by order, predictability, and an unsettling absence of cruelty. In February 1944, weeks after the first German prisoners had been processed into British camps, something quietly destabilizing began to take hold. It did not arrive with force. It did not announce itself. It emerged slowly, in the space between expectation and daily routine, where certainty had once lived. The men were no longer new arrivals. The shock of capture had faded. Transport was complete. The wire fences were familiar now. Guards had faces, names, habits. The camps had settled into a rhythm. And yet, the punishment that had been so vividly imagined still had not arrived. At first, this absence was explained away. Prisoners told themselves that British policy must involve delay. Perhaps authorities were waiting until camps were full. Perhaps they were allowing complacency to grow before enforcing harsher measures. Perhaps winter conditions limited certain practices. The explanations varied, but the belief remained intact. But as days became weeks and weeks became months, maintaining that belief required effort. The shock did not come from a single dramatic event. It came from small, persistent details that refused to align with indoctrination. Details that could not be dismissed easily. Details that repeated themselves with uncomfortable consistency. Every morning, roll call was conducted without shouting. Guards counted, checked numbers, and moved on. There were no public punishments for minor mistakes. Discipline existed, but it was procedural, not theatrical. For men trained to expect humiliation as a tool of control, this restraint felt wrong. Food was the next fracture point. Rations were not luxurious. They were plain, repetitive, and limited by wartime shortages. But they were irregular. Bread arrived daily. Soup was hot. Portions were measured, not arbitrary. Prisoners quickly realized that hunger was not being used as a weapon. Weight stabilized. Illness rates were monitored. Complaints about food were met not with retaliation but with indifference or explanation. This consistency unsettled them more than deprivation would have. Cleanliness followed. Barracks were basic but maintained. Latrines were functional. Showers existed. Medical inspections were routine. Sick men were separated and treated, not punished. Doctors spoke clinically, not ideologically. There were no lectures during treatment, no demands for gratitude. For prisoners conditioned to expect neglect, the presence of care was deeply confusing. The guards themselves became the most destabilizing element. They were not friendly, but neither were they cruel. They enforced rules without personal investment. Many were older men, reservists, or soldiers unfit for frontline service. They addressed prisoners formally. They did not provoke. They did not respond to insults. They rarely raised their voices. This emotional distance was interpreted at first as contempt. Prisoners assumed they were beneath notice. But over time, another interpretation intruded. Perhaps the guards simply did not hate them. That possibility was difficult to process. Work assignments added to the confusion. German POWs were employed in agriculture, construction, forestry, and maintenance. The work was physical but not excessive. Hours were defined. Tools were provided. Injuries were treated. Prisoners noticed that British civilians often worked alongside them, under similar conditions. This contradicted the idea of deliberate exploitation. In rural areas, prisoners were sometimes marched through villages to reach work sites. They braced for hostility from civilians. They expected insults, thrown objects, visible hatred. What they encountered instead was something else entirely: indifference, curiosity, occasionally quiet politeness. Some civilians avoided eye contact. Others nodded briefly. Children watched silently. There were no mobs, no chants, no public displays of revenge. This absence was not comforting. It was destabilizing. German prisoners had been taught that British society was unified in its hatred, that every civilian carried resentment sharpened by years of bombing and loss. The reality was more fragmented. Britain was tired. Civilians were focused on rationing, work, and survival. German POWs were a logistical issue, not an emotional one. For the prisoners, this realization created cognitive tension. If the civilians did not hate them, then the narrative of universal hostility began to weaken. Inside the camps, time played its role. Days repeated themselves. Routines became predictable. Predictability is dangerous to indoctrination. It allows space for reflection, and reflection invites comparison. Men began to compare what they had been told with what they were experiencing, not openly, not in formal discussions, but quietly, in fragmented observations. One man noticed that letters were delivered without censorship delays beyond the norm. Another observed that guards did not interfere with religious practices. Another remarked that officers were still addressed by rank. Each observation alone was insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern. The most unsettling realization came slowly. The British did not seem interested in breaking them psychologically. There were no forced political lectures, no attempts to extract confessions, no systematic humiliation. The camps were not designed to erase identity. They were designed to contain, feed, and manage. This realization did not bring relief. It brought suspicion. If the British were not trying to break them, then what were they doing? Why allow German discipline to persist? Why permit internal order? Why enforce rules fairly rather than arbitrarily? Some prisoners concluded that this was a more sophisticated form of control, that kindness itself was a weapon, that comfort was being used to soften resistance and extract compliance later. This explanation preserved belief while accommodating reality, but it did not fully satisfy. The erosion continued through contact with information. British newspapers were sometimes made available, heavily limited but present. Prisoners noticed differences in tone. There was no triumphant hatred. Reports were restrained. Civilian casualties were acknowledged. British losses were mentioned. This contrasted sharply with German wartime media. Listening to the radio, when allowed, produced similar effects. The British Broadcasting Corporation did not speak like Nazi radio. There was no constant exhortation, no emotional escalation. The calmness itself was unsettling. prisoners were not suddenly convinced of British virtue. They were confused by British normalcy. The psychological shock lay precisely here, not in kindness, but in the absence of expected cruelty. Indoctrination had prepared them for suffering. It had not prepared them for banality. The camps felt administratively dull. There was no drama, no clear villain, no narrative arc. Days passed without significant incident. This forced prisoners to confront a frightening possibility, that they had been prepared for a version of Britain that did not exist. Still, certainty did not collapse immediately. Humans protect their beliefs fiercely, especially beliefs tied to identity and survival. Instead, prisoners experienced a period of internal tension. They held two contradictory ideas simultaneously. Britain was cruel, Britain was not acting cruelly. This tension manifested as irritability, mistrust, and hypervigilance. Men watched guards more closely. They analyzed tone and gesture. They searched for hidden motives. They scrutinized rule changes. They waited for confirmation of their original fears. But confirmation did not come. As spring turned to summer in 1944, routines remained stable. The war continued elsewhere, but inside the camps, the environment was strangely insulated. News arrived slowly. Battles were discussed academically. Prisoners began to realize that their personal suffering was not the focus of British policy. For soldiers raised in a system that equated doubt with disloyalty, this was destabilizing in a profound way. The shock deepened through comparison with other captors. Stories filtered in from prisoners captured by the Soviets. These accounts were fragmented and often exaggerated, but the contrast was stark. British camps appeared increasingly anomalous, not humane in an ideal sense, but restrained, predictable, and bureaucratic. German prisoners began to realize that not all enemies behaved the same way. This realization undermined one of the core assumptions of Nazi ideology, that enemies were unified, monolithic, and uniformly hostile. Britain's behavior suggested complexity, and complexity is corrosive to absolutism. By late 1944, some prisoners began to articulate their confusion, cautiously among trusted companions. They did not praise Britain. They questioned their own expectations. Why had we been told this would be worse? Why has nothing happened? Why are we still treated like soldiers? These questions did not produce immediate answers, but they marked a shift. The psychological shock was no longer external. It had moved inward. The camps had not changed. The prisoners had. They were still captives, still behind wire, still uncertain about the future. But the enemy they had been taught to fear was no longer behaving according to script. And when an expectation persists long enough without confirmation, it does not fade gently. It fractures. By the end of 1944, many German POWs in Britain reached an unsettling realization. Something fundamental about what they had been taught was wrong. Not exaggerated, not misinterpreted. Wrong. They had not yet replaced that belief with a new understanding. That would take time. What they experienced instead was disorientation, a quiet, persistent unease that followed them through daily routines. The shock was complete not because Britain had been kind, but because Britain had been ordinary. And in that ordinariness, the certainty that had once sustained them. In May 1945, as the war in Europe formally ended, German prisoners inside British camps confronted a reality they had delayed facing for months. The conflict that had structured their fears, justified their beliefs, and sustained their expectations was over. There would be no sudden reversal, no hidden phase of punishment, no final revelation of cruelty. What remained was the slow, unavoidable collapse of a worldview. For many prisoners, the end of the war did not bring immediate celebration or despair. It brought something quieter and more difficult to endure. Certainty was gone. During the final months of fighting, news had filtered into the camps with increasing clarity. German armies were retreating on all fronts. Cities were falling. Leadership was silent or absent. By the time official confirmation arrived, most prisoners already understood the outcome. But understanding defeat and accepting its implications were not the same thing. The belief system that had shaped their expectations of Britain had been built to withstand hardship, not contradiction. It could accommodate suffering. It could even accommodate death. What it could not accommodate was sustained normality under enemy control. As repatriation plans were discussed and camp routines continued, German prisoners were forced into prolonged reflection. There was time now. Too much time. The routines that once distracted them from doubt now created space for it. The questions that had first appeared as discomfort in 1944 returned with greater urgency. Why had British captivity unfolded this way? Why had fear been so carefully cultivated if it did not correspond to reality? And if this fear had been false, what else had been constructed on the same foundation? These questions did not arrive as revelations. They emerged as erosion. Officers who had once enforced ideological discipline within the camps found it increasingly difficult to maintain authority. Their credibility rested on assumptions that no longer held. Younger soldiers listened less. Conversations shifted from certainty to speculation. The language of inevitability weakened. This did not lead to rebellion or chaos. It led to quiet disengagement. Some prisoners turned inward. They reread old letters, re-examined memories, replayed moments of training and indoctrination with new perspective. Statements that had once sounded authoritative now appeared theatrical. Warnings that had felt pragmatic now seemed exaggerated. Others sought external reference points. British camp libraries, limited but present, became places of cautious exploration. History books, novels, and newspapers offered a tone radically different from German wartime material. There was no insistence, no demand for agreement. The psychological collapse did not involve replacing one ideology with another. It involved the loss of ideological structure itself. For men accustomed to clear categories, this was profoundly destabilizing. The world no longer divided neatly into enemies and allies, cruelty and virtue, truth and deception. Instead, it appeared fragmented and contingent. Post-war interviews and memoirs reveal how unsettling this period was for many former POWs. They did not describe British camps as liberating. They described them as disorienting. The camps had removed not only freedom of movement, but freedom from thought. There was no longer an external enemy to blame for internal contradictions. British policy had not aimed at psychological destruction, but its effects were nevertheless transformative. By refusing to behave as expected, British authorities inadvertently forced prisoners to confront the fragility of belief systems built on fear. This confrontation mattered beyond the camps. When prisoners were gradually released and returned to Germany, they carried this internal shift with them. It influenced how they interpreted defeat, responsibility, and memory. Those who had experienced British captivity often struggled to reconcile their treatment with the narrative still circulating at home. In post-war Germany, stories diverged sharply based on where prisoners had been held. Accounts from the East emphasized suffering, brutality, and chaos. Accounts from Britain emphasized monotony, restraint, and quiet confusion. Neither group denied hardship, but the nature of that hardship differed fundamentally. For former British-held POWs, the challenge was not recounting trauma, it was explaining absence, explaining why the enemy they had feared had not behaved as predicted, explaining why captivity had dismantled certainty rather than reinforced it. Some were accused of exaggeration, others of disloyalty. Their experiences did not fit comfortably into post-war narratives that sought clear moral boundaries. Historians examining these accounts later identified a pattern. British captivity had not re-educated prisoners through force. It had done so through predictability. By treating German POWs as a logistical responsibility rather than a moral enemy, Britain had stripped ideology of its emotional fuel. Fear requires reinforcement. Hatred requires stimulation. Without these, belief systems weaken.
This outcome was not inevitable. It was a result of deliberate administrative choices. British adherence to international law, even when resources were strained, created an environment where cruelty was unnecessary. Camps were designed to function, not to intimidate. Guards were instructed to enforce rules, not to perform dominance.
These choices were not altruistic in a simple sense. They reflected strategic calculation. Britain needed labor, it needed stability, it needed to manage hundreds of thousands of prisoners without creating unrest. But the psychological consequences extended far beyond logistics. By denying prisoners the suffering they expected, Britain denied them the validation of their beliefs. This denial forced reflection. Former prisoners later described the moment, often difficult to pinpoint, when they realized they had been wrong, not just about Britain, but about certainty itself. That realization did not produce admiration. It produced humility, a recognition that conviction had been manufactured and maintained through repetition rather than evidence. This realization mattered in the reconstruction of post-war Europe. It contributed to a generation of men who approached authority with greater skepticism, who understood how fear could be weaponized, who had experienced the collapse of belief not through violence but through contradiction. The camps did not create democrats. They created witnesses. Witnesses to the power of expectation. Witnesses to the vulnerability of certainty. Witnesses to the fact that human perception is shaped less by experience than by preparation. British camps became, unintentionally, laboratories of psychological transition. They demonstrated that the most effective way to dismantle false belief is not to attack it directly, but to let reality quietly contradict it. In this sense, the experience of German POWs in Britain offers a broader lesson. Propaganda thrives on extremes. It requires enemies to be monstrous and allies to be flawless. It collapses in the presence of complexity. When prisoners encountered guards who were neither cruel nor compassionate, civilians who were neither hostile nor welcoming, and systems that were neither punitive nor generous, they encountered something propaganda could not explain. That normalcy forced an internal reckoning that no lecture could have achieved. By the time the last German POWs left Britain in the late 1940s, the camps themselves were already fading into memory. Huts were dismantled, fields were returned to agriculture, physical traces disappeared. What remained was intangible. A generation of men had learned that certainty could be engineered, that fear could be taught, and that belief, once broken, does not easily return to its original form. They did not leave Britain with gratitude or resentment alone. They left with awareness. Awareness that the enemy they had feared had not needed to punish them to defeat an idea. Awareness that restraint can be destabilizing. Awareness that expectation, once contradicted, collapses inward. The story of German POWs in British camps is therefore not a story of kindness overcoming cruelty. It is a story of belief confronting reality. And in that confrontation, the most powerful weapon was not force, but the quiet persistence of ordinary behavior. In the end, what German prisoners never thought possible was not humane treatment alone. It was the realization that the world they had been taught to fear was more complex than the one they had been taught to believe in. That realization outlasted captivity. It followed them home, and it reshaped how they understood the past, the war, and themselves.